everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Insurtech Building Blocks podcast. Glad you're here. My name is Cory Schmidt, and I'm your host for the day. Really excited to have the guest on that we have today. Actually, I was able to spend time with Bill very recently at our user conference, the Block Builder Conference in Arizona, and really got a chance to spend time with him and understand kind of his background and what he brings to the table and things that are interesting from an industry perspective that I think our viewers are going to be interested in learning about. So, welcome to the podcast, Bill. Glad you're here.
Thanks for having me, Corey. Great seeing you again virtually this time, but it was great meeting you in person, and now it's great to see you again a couple weeks later.
Yeah, same. Have you been home in the time between Arizona and now?
You know what? I think I've been home for 3 days since then, and as you know, I was on the road for about 3 weeks prior to that. And I'm heading out again on Monday, going to the Benefit Pro event out in Boston, and then from there, I'm flying to Winnipeg to meet with one of our pharmacy partners, and then to British Columbia, and then I'll be back home again. So
Man,
I told you last time I was a little concerned that the dog was going to bite me when I walked in the door. She didn't bite me, but she definitely was sniffing around, wondering who the strange old guy walking around the house was for a few days.
yeah, it does seem like all of the events and travel like are particularly compressed in this time of the year, in the late spring time frame. I've been traveling a lot as well, but it's interesting that you mentioned Benefit Pro. That was, I think, was probably the very first conference that Adam, my co-founder, and I actually exhibited at. And the team has lots of jokes about, what we looked like and how unprofessional our booth setup was. But man, we still have a lot of really awesome customers from that event. And this is, going on probably a decade ago, but it seems like a lot of really strong employer benefits brokers attend that conference based on my experience.
I think it's a great event. I can tell you, Casey and I, my business partner, talk about our evolution all the time too. When we set our first booth up, trying to go after the employer market and tell our story in that spot, and looking back to that a decade ago, and that where we are now, and kind of the evolution. You talk about the booth, and you think, man, what were we thinking? And I think the story was a little bit. Same story, but kind of presented differently. And for me, what I've noticed is events like your block builder event, like Benefit Pro, the consultants are coming in and they're really people that are thinking differently now. You know what I mean? It's not just that typical, "Hey, we just do it this is the way we've always done it. Don't shake up the apple cart." People are really having those conversations. The vendors that you see now are just, there's so much innovation happening in the industry. And unfortunately, in the benefits world and insurance in general, we're always kind of behind the curve, I think. But it seems like there's some really innovative folks. And I can tell you that I'm noticing, again, as a gray hair in the room, I'm seeing more and more young faces, which is exciting to me because I know these people have ideas that, I didn't even think about. I know I was an innovator a decade ago and 20 years ago, but now I think we're still innovators. But I see some of these young people thinking about things that we just, doesn't even cross my mind. And I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's great. I love, yeah, to your point, I love the new perspectives coming into the market and, some of the questions. I think it's a good opportunity for people to question assumptions that we've had along the way, like the way we've always done business, the way we've always thought things should work or needed to work. And I love when there's new perspectives in that realm. So I think that's a great segue to talk a little bit about your story, Bill, as founder of Canadian Medstore. Like, how do you become to run and manage a company that imports prescription drugs from foreign countries? That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, my story is I didn't come from an insurance background. I didn't come from a pharmacy background. I actually was drawn to looking for lower cost prescription medications because my brother was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when he was 27 years old, went through a bone marrow transplant. And I can tell you, even 25 years ago, his anti-rejection medication that he needed was costing, thousands of dollars here in the US. And we were hearing stories at the time about families, that were driving over to Canada, little old ladies that lived in Detroit that were going to Windsor to buy their cholesterol medication or something like that. So we looked into sourcing my brother's medications, and we found that the same medication, same active ingredient, often manufactured by the exact same company, was being sold in Canada for a few $100. Where here we were spending tens of thousands of dollars on the same thing. So I came back to Tampa, told a physician friend of mine that story, and he said, Bill, I write prescriptions every single day, and my senior patients are not taking their medications because they can't afford them, or they're cutting their pills in half, or using their inhaler every third day. So I said, well, heck, if you can do it in Detroit, Michigan, you can't just jump in your car if you live in Tampa, Florida. How do we open that up to these folks? So we created relationships with pharmacies in Canada, and we allowed for those pharmacies to be mailed directly to our clients here in Tampa. And we expanded from that. And now we have clients in all 50 states, helping them get medications from licensed pharmacies in Canada, Australia, New Zealand for a lot less expensive.
Yeah, interesting. And you were explaining that you actually have a team of pharmacists that helps navigate that process, like that because that seems like, impossible. Like my doc gives me a prescription, like I feel like I need to drive to the pharmacy down the street. Like how does this work practically? Like I've got a prescription in my hand. I know it's going to be really expensive. I need to save some money. Like how would that work logistically
Yeah.
with
So
Canadian Medstore?
interestingly, our number one referral source is actually primary care physicians, because they want their patients to be compliant on their medication. They know that when they write that prescription or that piece of paper or that e-scribe that they send, that doesn't do anybody any good unless they can take the medication. So our number one referral source is actually physicians. Our number two referral source is a very, very close second, is health insurance agents who are working with these people, looking at that every single day. So in general, somebody comes across that expensive medication, something that they can't afford. They go back to the doctor and say, "Hey, I can't afford this," or they talk to their health insurance agent and say, "Hey, this isn't covered by the plan, or it's covered, but I haven't hit my deductible yet." They're referred over to us, and what we do is we look through our database of pharmacies, whether they be Canada, which is how we started, or it could be a pharmacy in the UK or in Australia, New Zealand. We then provide them with a price quote. Hey, this drug costs $1,000 here in the United States, but it's only $200 in the UK. At that point, we take that prescription from a U.S. doctor, we send it over to our pharmacy partner. Our pharmacy partner, obviously, they're a licensed pharmacy. They have their pharmacists on staff review the prescription, package up the medication, and then mail it directly to the individual here in the United States. So the easiest way to think about it is if you lived in Detroit, Michigan, you could drive 10 minutes away to a pharmacy in Windsor, walk in, provide your prescription, walk out with your medication. And we're doing the same thing, except we're utilizing mail order and having those medications mailed from that pharmacy, whether it be in Winnipeg, Canada, or London, England, directly to the individual here in the United States.
Wow, really interesting. And I frankly didn't realize that you could still just drive across the border and buy a drug with a prescription and bring it back over. Like, I imagine there's a fair amount of logistics as it relates to like the safety and some of the controls that are in place when you're importing drugs from a foreign country. Like, is that just as simple as, they mail them directly? Like, I think the countries you've partnered with have similar protections for patients. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only speak for my companies, Canadian Medstore and RX Manage, but yeah, all the pharmacies we work with are actually brick and mortar pharmacies. So if you were a Canadian citizen and you were going to go fill your Eliquis prescription or fill an EpiPen for your kid, you'd walk into that pharmacy, fill that prescription, and walk right out, just like we would walk into our neighborhood pharmacies. So the pharmacies we partner with are actually brick and mortar, actual licensed pharmacies right there. Let's use Canada as the example. So yes, the industry actually started by individuals that lived in those northern states that recognized they could drive over to Canada and buy their prescriptions. 23 years ago, when I started our company, that was kind of the evolution of the internet and people becoming more worldly, I think, and recognizing that we were a world economy now. So we utilize the same provisions that are created through what's called the personal importation regulations, which allows for an individual to order up to a 90-day supply of medications for personal use. There are certain medications that can't be ordered internationally, things like controlled substances, so narcotics, certain type of human growth hormones, sleep aids, things like that. Anything that would be a controlled narcotic type of medication. Number one, we wouldn't touch that. That's not something that you really want to do through mail order. We focus on maintenance medication, so the medications that people use to treat their COPD or their high blood pressure or a diabetes medication, medications, things like that, a maintenance drug that someone's taking. The other thing that's important to know is that no one's coming to us to fill a generic medication. If you can get that generic drug for $2 or $4 or $10, at your local drugstore, or if you can go on to GoodRx or Mark Cuban's Cost Plus or something like that for those generic drugs, those are the drugs that people don't need to go to Canada for. The joke in our office is if you see it advertised on TV, or if you open up a magazine and see it, or if it pops up on your screen when you're searching the internet, those are the drugs that we know we're going to be able to help you save money for through Canada, because those are the brand name drugs that don't have a generic equivalent here in the United States, which means that those drug companies can really charge whatever they want. And we're paying literally two, three, four, five times what other countries are paying for those same medications. So those are the drugs that would want to be ordered from Canada. So a very small percentage of the overall prescriptions, people are going to benefit from getting it internationally, but they're the typical ones that are driving either an individual crazy because the costs are so high, or even larger than that, these self-funded employer groups who are paying massive amounts of money. You probably know that, 4 or 5% of the employee population is often driving 80 or even 90% of the overall healthcare costs, because those are the high utilizers.
Yeah, and why are these prescriptions so much cheaper in those countries that you're sourcing them from?
People often ask me, why are the drugs so much less expensive in the United States? And I say, the question is really, why is it so much more expensive here in the US than, well, why is it so much, they ask, why is it so much less expensive in Canada, let's say, and I say,
Yeah,
why
sorry.
is it
That's
so much
yeah,
more
that's what I
expensive here in
mean.
the US? And the real reason is because, the drug companies here can charge whatever they want until the Inflation Reduction Act, which created the ability for the federal government to negotiate drug prices. And as we all know, that's only impacting a very, very small amount of medications. Most of those medications are already coming off patent anyway. So it's a little bit of a shell game and optical political play. But the truth is, here in the United States, we don't have any way to actually regulate what pharmaceutical companies can charge for prescription medications, where in most other industrialized countries, they negotiate a price. They say, hey, listen, through our socialized medicine system, we're going to buy a whole heck of a lot of X drug. We want a better price than somebody who's walking in and buying just one medication and negotiate the price. We don't do that here in the United States. As a matter of fact, the Medicare Modernization Act made it illegal for the federal government to negotiate drug prices. So that's the main reason why. The other reason is obviously now when the US dollar is so strong, we get the benefit of being able to, utilize that US dollar strength of buying a medication from an international pharmacy. And I think the other thing that's the big one that a lot of people forget about is the drug companies here are so powerful that they can continue to extend patents over and over and over again. We've heard about that where they make, this is a whole nother 3-hour conversation, but all kinds of ways that they can play games with the patents, where often a drug will go generic overseas prior to it being generic here in the United States, which obviously that competition then drives the price of the medication down. So those are really the main reasons why going internationally helps people save a lot of money on their
Yeah,
prescriptions.
and if those drugs go generic overseas before they've gone generic here, can you get access to those drugs as well?
We often can, yeah. As a matter of fact, that's one of the ways that we can help people save even more money by accessing the generic drug. I will tell you though, about half of our customers though say, you know what, I'd like to save a few more dollars by going generic, but if I can get the brand name drug that I'm used to getting here in the United States and I'm already going to be saving $500, you know what, I'm going to stick with that brand name. So we always give folks both options. If it is available as a generic, we can offer that to them. But I would tell you that probably at least half of our customers say, you know what, we're going to just stick with that brand name, but we always give them that option, especially for people that are very, very cost sensitive. You have to remember some of these self employed individuals that are really paying for their own prescriptions, a lot of seniors that are on prescription drug plans that maybe don't cover a certain drug or they have a high deductible. And those are the folks that are going to be very, very cost sensitive. So sometimes that generic drug, those few dollars more worth of savings can make a big difference to that individual.
Yeah, it's interesting how we have benefited from socialized medicine in other countries, and the power of negotiation. Here, I always blamed it on, all the TV commercials and ads in the magazines, which I'm sure also contributes to some of that as well. But I don't know if this is really going to happen, but I've heard that, maybe the administration is going to try to push for, outlawing certain kinds of commercials for prescription drugs, at least maybe on television.
Yeah, there was
But
a lot of talk
maybe that will
in
help.
the first Trump administration. They actually tried to do that, and it was challenged by the pharmaceutical industry, and they basically shot it down under freedom of speech laws and things like that. I'd tell you too that I agree, Cory. I mean, us and New Zealand are the only two countries that allow for direct to consumer advertising of prescription drugs. So it makes a big difference. I mean, if like me, you're a sports fan and you're watching a football game or a baseball game, you'll know that every other commercial is a drug commercial. I will tell you though that I think that's one of the ways that, yes, would we impact the cost a little bit. I think doctors are super frustrated with that because people walk in and say, "Hey, I saw this commercial and this is what I need." But whether or not that's really the reason that we're spending so much more than the rest of the world on the prescriptions, I don't think so. I think it's the simple fact that the drug companies, in their defense, they need to recuperate the research and development cost of what it costs to take a drug to market. You've probably heard that, the estimate is it's about $1 billion to take a drug from concept to market, a billion with a B. So the drug companies need to recoup those dollars, understandably. And as a business person, I certainly don't want to see any type of, controls, meaning that somebody's dictating to you what you can charge and what you can't charge. The argument that we've always made is that when do we stop making the Americans be the only ones that are paying that high cost? When do we start shifting those costs to the Canucks and to the Aussies and to the Kiwis and to the Brits? These other first world countries that are basically riding on the coattails of the US. And let's face it, the drug companies are making money when they're selling the drugs to the Brits, or they wouldn't be doing it. They're just not making as much money as they're making on through us because they know that they can charge that much here. I think the other thing to remember, and we really get into the weeds, but our system here is based on an employer-sponsored health system. So that means that the average person is getting their coverage through their employer, or they're on Medicare, Medicaid, or VA, coverage. So because of that, the average American never really sees the true cost of the prescriptions. They go in and they pay their co-payment. So you and I, as taxpayers paying for Medicare, either paying for that, or the employer who's paying for the cost of the prescriptions are paying that. The average individual doesn't really see that medication they just filled is cost, that Eliquis is costing $650 every time it's filled, because all they know is they're paying a $50 co-payment. And they're upset about the $50 co-payment because a year ago it was 35, you know what I mean? But not recognizing what the true cost of care is. And that's the big difference. Here in the United States, the average consumer of healthcare doesn't really know what the real cost of care is because their insurance is paying for it, and they're paying the co-payment to pick up that medication.
Yeah, I know. I think we're with United Healthcare, I think, as a company, and I know that they've really tried to provide tools online to get insights into the true cost of care of certain like procedures and things like that. Which is, it's nice to see the transparency, but like there's very little motivation really to leverage that or utilize that as an employee of a company, just because, to your point, Bill, like I'm just going to pay the copay, I'm going to pay the, I got to meet my deductible, whatever the case may be, on a high deductible, and then it doesn't really matter what it costs, right? I'm either paying zero or I'm meeting my deductibles.
And Corey, remember when the average American goes to seek care? They go to seek care because something bad has happened, or the baby got an earache, you know what I mean? And at that time, you're not looking, when the baby's got an earache and you need to get eardrops, you're not going, "Oh, you know what, let me log on and see where I can fill the medication for a little less expensive and save my employer a couple bucks." That's not the mindset. Or your spouse has been sick and they want you to go to get all these tests. We're not typically going, you know what, let me look and see if those tests are really worthwhile. If we know that we can hit the share of cost or hit our deductible and then it's all covered 100% after that, there's really not a motivation to do that. So the system is different here in the US than it is in the rest of the world. And Cory, I'm going to be the first to tell you, with all the speaking I do, I'm not an anti-pharma guy. I know that my brother wouldn't have been able to fight the fight that he fought, even 20 years ago, if it hadn't been for the advancements in pharmacology. I think even if you just look at COVID, and of course we can debate whether or not, that was handled correctly. But the fact is, when we put the American pharmaceutical industry at work, and you have really good people working in that world, really smart people, a whole heck of a lot smarter than me, we can do amazing things. It's not pharma's fault. The system is just set up that it is the way it is. You know what I mean? And I'm certainly not arguing for a socialized medicine system. I can tell you that I told you that we work with pharmacists and physicians from throughout the world, and every one of them, to a person, would tell me that if they got sick, or if a family member of theirs got sick, they would want to be here in the United States to get treatment, because us as Americans have access to treatments that don't exist in other countries. We have access to pharmacology that don't exist simply because some of the other countries say it's not financially viable for us to pay for that product. We're going to give you an older product that maybe isn't as good, but it's more affordable. Here in the United States, we get the best care. We have access to the best care in the world. The issue is how do we pay for that care? And so I want to be very, very cautious not to make anybody think that I'm arguing for a socialized system. All I'm arguing for is that the drugs are less expensive in Canada. If an individual has access to those drugs, that's true free market. We're saying, listen, if we can get
Mhm.
access to those prescriptions in Canada, let that individual have that opportunity to do that. If you choose to fill your prescription locally and you want to pay more for it, no one's telling you you have to fill your medication in Canada, but understand that it is an option for you, and that for decades, Americans that live on those northern border states have literally been driving over to Canada to fill their prescriptions and doing it on a regular basis. So much so that the FDA and Border and Customs has created those guidance that we talked about: 90-day supplies, non-controlled substances, care of a U.S. doctor. Those regulations and those guidance are in place so that people can do that and do it compliantly.
Yeah, you're really just rebalancing who's subsidizing the cost of those drugs and in terms of, getting them from some of the countries that have lower rates, which I think is a really neat idea. Bill, you mentioned a little bit about employer groups, and I saw that one of the recent Kaiser Family Foundation's surveys said that the number one concern for employers is drug costs, specifically specialty drugs. I'm curious, like it sounds like that's exactly down the middle of the fairway for what Canadian Medstore does in terms of helping with some of those really expensive drugs, those specialty drugs that don't have generic alternatives. You work with brokers. What does that look like to engage with a broker and an employer group? And how does that kind of play out in terms of helping those employees maybe curb those costs from importing drugs from other countries?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the Kaiser survey. We've seen a bunch of those from other employer groups too. The number one concern typically for employers is healthcare, and then specifically prescriptions, and then specifically on top of that specialty medications. Typically, the way that we engage with brokers, we don't go direct to employers. We only work through the broker and agent channel. As a matter of fact, a few times that we have had communications with a an employer directly, I always say, listen, let's get your broker involved. They're the ones that are really handling. You're building widgets or running a school district or selling cars. Your healthcare guy, your agent, your consultant is the one who handles that, and that's who we want to be at the table with, because the agents are looking at it holistically. How do we make this plan better, more affordable, and give folks access to that care? But typically, what we do is we say, hey, let's look at your claims data. Let's see where you're filling those prescriptions. And you're right, Corey. It's typically one of the big expensive medications, the specialty drugs that made somebody's eyes pop out and said, hey, we need to do something about this. It's funny. I talk about a lot that when I started this business 20 years ago, those drugs that cost a few $100s a month were like, man, that's really expensive. How do we help people with that? Now it's almost like consultants and employers, unless it's $1,000 a month, it doesn't even phase them anymore. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But they typically come to us. And like I said, we scrub that data. We say, listen, on these, 95% of these drugs are generic. You guys are doing a great job. You're filling that where it should be filled. You're lowering your cost. But here's the 5% or 10% that's driving 80% of your cost. And those are going to be those specialty medications that are running 10 or 20 or $30,000 of fill. And what we typically do is look and say, well, can we source those medications from a pharmacy in Canada? If we can, we go back to that employer and we say, hey, this is the cost savings that we can have. Now, remember, we're not changing the medication. We're not changing the PBM. That PBM is still in place for 95% of those fills. But on these particular drugs that we found, we can save you a bunch of money. The other interesting thing is sometimes they come to us because that $30,000 drug is what's really made them nervous. But when we look at that, we recognize, you know what? There's a bunch of people that are taking Eliquis and Januvia and Janumet that aren't 30,000, but they're $600 a month. And when you multiply that by your 30 employees that are taking that and filling it over a 12-month supply, you know what? Just on those what we call smaller ones now, which are the $600, $800 a month drugs, we can save you even more money. So by looking at that data, we can typically help that employer, save a bunch of money. And we've looked at groups, Corey, where we have just 5 or 10 employees that we're able to shift over to international, but we can impact sometimes 60 or 70% of the overall spend, because those are the ones that are really driving the prescription drug costs. It's not the $4 or $10 generic drugs that's getting any individual or any group in trouble. It's those specialty, really expensive medications.
Interesting. And so I imagine the next step in the process, though, is the broker would need to work with the individual employees to have that conversation about being willing to kind of switch over to the mail order process instead of going to their local
Yeah, we
pharmacy.
have to communicate that with the individual. Remember, we're always going to want to make sure the employee knows too, like, the reason this drug is going to be less expensive is because we are going to source it through, through an international. So the employee always has to have access to that. They always have to know that they still have the option to fill it, domestically if they choose to. But yeah, the brokers involved with that, the HR folks are really, really good with communicating with people. And we're seeing more and more PBMs coming to us and saying, hey, we want to introduce international as part of our offering. Probably just a few years ago, PBMs looked at us as almost a competitor who's going to eat into the revenue stream. Once these PBMs, especially the more innovative PBMs, the true pass-through style PBM, the innovators that you and I are seeing at a lot of these events, they're recognizing that we're really only impacting a very small percentage of the overall fill. So we're really not impacting their revenue very, very badly, but they can show a massive savings to their employers. So what they're saying is, hey, listen, we're using you not only as a way to win new business, but also to retain our clients. And I think brokers see it the same way. Hey, listen, we can go utilize this as a way to win new clients over, but also some of our clients that we've been working with for years and really struggling getting that RX spend down. Hey, this is a way that we can immediately see an ROI because we know those individuals we need to target from the claims data that we have access to.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, So that's kind of the employer group model. Switching gears a little bit to kind of the individual market and specifically Medicare. I know you and I were chatting, Bill, just before we maybe went on stage for the State of the Industry panel, and I was telling you about my grandmother. When I got to Arizona, she's a snowbird, so I went to see her, and she pulled out her tray of prescriptions. All the bottles in this kind of like plastic tray, and so I was intrigued. I'm like, what is the cost of all of these bottles? And she made the comment that like most of it's like really inexpensive, to your comment, a few dollars here and there. But then she pointed at the one bottle and she's like, this one is really, really expensive. And I told you it was Eliquis, and you're like, I knew it. You said, I think you said to me, like, any Medicare agent that's been in this business for like 2 days knows what Eliquis is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's exactly. I think the way I remember the conversation is I always say that if you've been in the business, if you've been in the Medicare business for more than 2 days, you've heard of Eliquis. I mean, if you've been in the business for more than 2 weeks, you've actually had that experience of walking into a senior's home and them, bringing out their tray or bag or list or whatever it happens to be, and hey, here's the medications I'm taking. So welcome to the world of Medicare. But yeah, that's exactly it. That's what we just talked about on the employer side is actually what we've evolved into. Our original business model and the model that still exists on the individual side is exactly that, working with seniors who can't afford their prescription medication. You got to remember, when we started our company, there was no such thing as Medicare Part D, so we've evolved into helping people that have that Part D plan. But under the IRA, we know that there's massive changes, some very, very good changes for individuals, but some people like your grandmother who maybe is taking a bunch of generics but only that one expensive drug like Eliquis, she's going to have to hit that deductible. She's going to have to pay a higher premium. She's going to probably have to pay higher co-payments on that drug. And that $2,000 maximum out of pocket might not benefit somebody like her, where she can source that Eliquis from international pharmacy for $50 a month. So, for $600 a year, the same as what her deductible would be, she can get that medication from one of our international pharmacies. So an agent or a broker who's working with us might recognize, you know what, we don't have to put Mrs. Jones into this really expensive premium plan. We can keep her on the less expensive plan that she can fill all of her generics through, and we can fill the Eliquis generic or brand, whatever it happens to be, through the international pharmacy for less than what our deductible is going to be anyway. So there's ways to do that. I think the biggest thing for agents and brokers to recognize is, especially after the changes with the IRA, is to know that we're not a replacement for Part D. It's not something that somebody should rely on, for everything. What we are is that extra arrow in the quiver that when you have that person like your grandmother, hey, maybe this is a way to keep you on a lower cost plan and still get the coverage you need. Every agent, if you've been in the business for 6 months, has gotten that call that said, hey, you picked the right plan for me when I first signed up, when I was taking 3 generic drugs, but I just had this issue happen and now the doctor put me on Eliquis or Januvia or Janumet or Advair inhaler or Brio. I just went in to fill it. Now I've got to hit my, my deductible before it's covered, or maybe the drug isn't even going to be covered. That's where we can step in and help that person until the enrollment period comes around again. That's the main thing for folks to think about. Last thing I want to touch on that about the Eliquis is there's an example of Eliquis has not gone generic here in the United States. It won't be generic until the end of next year, but the patent has expired in the UK and in Canada. So in that situation, we could offer your grandmother the brand name, or for a little bit less expensive, she could fill the international generic as well. And that's a perfect example of where somebody has both options, which is going to be most, what's going to make you feel most comfortable and what's going to be really within your budget. You know what I mean? So
Right.
that's a perfect example of a drug that can be available internationally generically, even though the patent hasn't expired here in the US yet.
All right. Well, I'm going to have her talk to her agent or her broker. So I'm curious, on that front, how can you scalably educate and inform, the agent and broker market and support them, Bill? Like, I mean, there's thousands of agents out there trying to navigate this. They need help from a company like yours to navigate these more complex prescription drug costs. Like, what is that? I mean, you're on the road a lot. Is it going to conferences? Is that how you're getting them
I
educated
thought I
on
was going to
the
be retired. I thought after this podcast, I was going to be able to. I thought we were going to, with all your reach, I thought we were hitting every single Medicare agent out there. So
I think we are for sure,
the
yes. But
story has been told, right?
maybe for three out there who don't watch this, how would they learn about Canadian Medstore?
Well, number one, let me tell you that like we love working with you guys because we know that you're so respected, and the agents that work with you are just so devoted to the product that you guys are building, especially with the innovations that you're putting in now and some of the growth there. So again, we're speaking at events, all over the place. We're going to, we're participating obviously at your block builder event and at a bunch of different events. The NABIP chapters have been reaching out to us a lot because the number one conversation, going back to your Kaiser comment, whether you work in the individual world or you work in that group world, RX is something that people want knowledge for and really are looking for true ROI. How can we really help people save money? They can do that. They can, and agents can go right to our website, CanadianMedstore.com. They can sign up on our agent concierge link. And what that'll do, interesting, that we do differently than some competitors that are out there, is number one, agents know that they're talking to real people located here in Tampa, Florida. And what we do is we assign every agent, whether they're in the group world or in the individual Medicare world, with one of our agent concierges. And what that concierge does is they become the agent's rep. They become their person. So when an agent is referring a client, they're handing them off to a real person. They're not just saying, here's a website or here's a phone number somewhere. They're going to be able to say, hey, listen, Amber over at the Canadian Med Store is my person I want you to talk to. Cory is the person. Pam is the person. They're going to hand them off to that person. And then our team is going to handhold that client through the process, make sure they know what the cost is, make sure they know where it's coming from, helping them get their prescriptions, helping them track their packages, and helping them refill their medications ultimately after their 90-day supply is running low. So we do that because what we found is that the agents, especially the guys that I met at your events, they've worked so hard to build their book of business that the last thing they want to do is work with a group who's going to not service their clients properly or sending them to, just go Google it type thing. This gives them an opportunity to talk to real people. And to a person, agents have told us that's the best thing that they can do because that's the way they built their business, through relationships and through, referrals. And that's how we're looking to work. So folks can go to CanadianMedstore.com, or I'd love to be able to share a link with you that you can put out as part of the pod at the bottom of the podcast, so people can click right on that, sign up, and be introduced to one of our concierges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned I love how you referenced, the customer base that we have at Agency Block. I've always felt like they're some of the most sophisticated, high performing agents in the market. And it's really cool to see, folks like you, Bill, come to our event and like recognize the same thing. Like, these are people that really care about how they're running their business. They want to run it really effectively and efficiently so that they can spend more time with their customers. And I also had the realization, maybe a quick plug for one of our more recent innovations. We launched, well, officially earlier this year, RX Collect, which effectively allows, our customers to collect the prescription drugs from their beneficiaries in advance of AEP or in advance of a meeting. And I was just thinking, I'm like, well, when they select Eliquis, like we should tell them, like, just FYI, you may be able to get this drug from Canada or other sources for less expensive than buying it at US based pharmacies. But I think there's some interesting things we could explore there in terms of just
Yeah,
helping
we
them
we need to
understand.
talk about that. I'm not a tech guy, so I'm always like, "Yeah, let's just do that," and then you guys tell me, "Oh, it's not as easy as that." But the truth is, I would tell you probably in the Medicare world, we I could probably identify probably 25 drugs that are probably 85% of the drugs that are filled for our folks are on Medicare. So, quite honestly, if there's a way for us to flag those and let them know that, agents that we work with typically say, you know what, once I see Eliquis, once I see Januvia, I know that I want to run the plan two different ways. I want to run it with the drug in there, and I want to run it without and see what the differences are. So there's definitely ways to do that. And yeah, I want to comment on your customer base. I've been to your event, I think 3 or 4 times now, and the folks that we know that work with Agency Block, you're right. It's a sophisticated agent. But when I say sophisticated, I mean sophisticated that they want to run their business sophisticatedly, but they want to have access to their customers, to their clients. They want to still be able to. The reason why they're automating is really not because they want to make their job so much easier, meaning lazy. They want to do it so they can actually spend more time with their clients. And that's what I see is that most of them are building their agencies because they provide that service, because they do answer their phone, because they do respond to emails, and what they're looking to do is free up more time so they can do that, do a better job with that. So I got to tell you, I've always said that the people that we meet at your events are doing that. The other thing I think that's important to know is that these are folks that are willing to take time out of their busy schedules and attend an event where they can hear about innovative strategies and talk about what can we do. That's a different type of agent because a lot of agents want to just do the easiest thing they can do, and why do I want to add any extra on there? Just like comparing a drug through Canada, an agent doesn't have to do that. They can just say, "Hey, here's the plan I'm going to put you on." But I can promise you that if you take the time to do that for your client, the agent that walked in before you and the agent that's walking in after you trying to steal your business from you, they're not doing that. They're not spending that extra time. That client's not leaving you once you're the one who figured out how to, lower their prescription drug costs. And I can also promise you that the agents that we work closely with tell us all the time that a lot of their referrals come because they help their client save money on Eliquis. Well, guess what? If they're taking Eliquis, we know how many folks are taking that medication. Somebody else in that social circle that person talks to is also taking Eliquis. So they're reaching out to that agent. It's a great way to build not only your trust, but literally your client base. It's a referral source because RX is such a concern for everybody. The guy who walked in before you and the guy walking in after you are selling the same Part D plans. What separates you from that other agent is the fact that you can service them better and that you actually care enough that you're going to go through some other options with them and say, hey, here's something else you might want to consider.
Yeah, our mantra has always been to connect the dots, and that just doesn't mean just technology. It's like connecting the dots on ideas, best practices, how to effectively run an agency. And I think it was, we've gotten some validation. I think already a third of the people who attended Block Builder this year have signed up for next year, which is crazy. I mean, we're just a few weeks out from concluding it, so it's just really awesome to see the support, and I'm super excited for next year. Maybe one last topic as we wrap up, Bill. I'm very curious about the topic that maybe you can't avoid when you turn on the news, which is tariffs. And so I have a pretty good handle from the mainstream media, like how bad tariffs are going to affect Chinese imports. But I'm curious on the prescription drug front from the countries that you're working with. What is the impact, if anything, from the tariffs that are rolling out?
Let me tell you this, Corey. The funny thing is, I've been doing this, like I said, for 23 years, and I thought we've answered every single question about safety and quality and all kinds of, I mean, everything from tracking questions, whatever. And out of all those years, I never ever had anybody say to me, what about a tariff? Like it just wasn't the topic of conversation. We talked about this a little bit at Agency Block. I think we all knew a little bit about tariffs from like an old history class or whatever, but like no one really kind of understood it. Now you go to dinner and we're having like conversations and your buddy is an expert on tariffs. You know what I mean? So we get the question all the time, whether it's from our employer groups, whether it's from our clients who've been ordering from us for years. Our understanding from the folks that we've spoken to in DC is that Tariffs will not impact individual personal importation. So if a person's ordering their medication from a pharmacy in Canada for their own personal importation, that's not going to be impacted by tariffs. But the bigger conversation about tariffs is what is going to be impacted, and the White House has already talked about this, is pharmaceutical ingredients and pharmaceuticals that are manufactured overseas are definitely going to be impacted by tariffs. What that means is I think people are going to even need more access to international prescriptions because the cost of prescription drugs here in the United States is going to go up because of tariffs. It's just simply the way it is. We might have talked about it a little bit too. I think what a lot of folks don't even think about, they think it's just a financial conversation. The current administration is very, very concerned from a national security type of conversation because you may be aware that over 80% of the prescription medications that are filled here in the United States are not actually manufactured here in the United States. One of the largest manufacturers of prescription medications or the ingredients that come for prescription medications is China. And we know that at the end of the day, we may work out some of this tariff stuff with everybody else, but China and the US are definitely going to be at odds on that. So there's almost no getting away from the fact that prescription drug costs here in the United States are going to rise. And I think there is going to be a big push to bring manufacturing back to the US of prescription medications, which may be a good thing for our national security, but that is going to impact the cost of the prescriptions. One of the reasons why we're manufacturing so many medications in India and China right now is because the cost of the manufacturing is so much less expensive. So ultimately, my answer to you is I don't think that our current clients are going to be impacted by tariffs. At least that's what we're hearing. But I do think when we talk about the industry in general, meaning prescription drug costs, not international prescription, the costs are going to go up. And even for those generic drugs that we're used to getting for, $2 fill, there's been a lot of conversations that generic drug manufacturers saying we're simply not going to be able to do it at what we're currently spending. We're going to have to increase that cost or get out of the generic drug manufacturing side of the business because there's just not a lot of margin in there. The name brand guys are making a bunch of margin. The generic guys are making very, very tight margins, and there's not a lot of wiggle room without raising prices.
Right, those input prices go up, as do the drugs they're having to import back into the US. I never really connected the dots. It sounds to me like, Bill, you need to rapidly expand the team and prepare for a lot more demand.
Well, hey, we're building all the time. So anybody out there who is looking to help, we're looking to hire for sure. But our like I've told you, Cory, our main team is really the agents and the brokers that are out there telling the story because we're bringing them real value, and hopefully they recognize that we're doing it. You heard the story about my brother. We got involved in this business because we were trying to do the right thing. I certainly didn't think we were going to have a 23-year run. We thought we were going to, make a little bit of a difference and the prescription drug costs changed. That's not the case. We had our busiest year we've ever had last year. And sometimes we talk about when the government steps in and says, "Oh, we're going to do all this to actually lower the costs." Are they really lowering the cost of prescriptions, or are they just shifting the cost some way? And that's how we typically see it. All the changes I've seen in my 23-year career, when the government steps in, the actual cost goes up. It doesn't actually come down.
Yeah. It's a cool story. I love how you're helping consumers, you're helping brokers and agents bring better solutions to them. Congrats on a lot of success, and appreciate you taking the time to spend with us, Bill. It's been very insightful, and look forward to crossing paths again soon on the road.
I'm sure we'll see each other again at some point. And I will tell you one thing: if we actually do succeed in lowering the cost of prescriptions, that means we're going out of business. But that'll make me pretty darn happy if I go out of business because we actually impact the cost of care here in the United States. That's a positive thing. But just know, Corey, I may be calling on you for a job, pitch an agency block at some point. But
All
that'll
right.
be that'll be a very happy day in my life. That if we actually go out of business because we did something to lower the cost of care, that'll be a pretty good spot. Until then, we're going to keep motoring along, working with clients, working with agents, working with guys like you over at Agency Block to change the world.
That's awesome. Appreciate it, Bill. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, brother.